Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. It's been quite a ride. I saw lots of tombs in the snow on the way here. I gather is a feature of the locality. I'm just going to put my timer on here so I know where I am. I want to add just a little thing to the introduction, which is that I now spend all my time, it seems, writing a blog called The Daily Dish, which has kind of consumed my entire life over the last few years, but in which this subject, of course, comes up quite a lot. And I want to talk tonight about it as frankly and as clearly as I can, and to invite you really to have a conversation about the subject. So much of the discussions about social issues like gay rights or abortion, or indeed now even prosaic things like public sector union benefits, seem to be ideologically riven. It's one side yelling at the other. There is a profound and irrational and cultural divide going on that makes discussing all these questions increasingly difficult. And for a very long time, this debate was really one side shouting perverts and the other side shouting faggots. And, the other side shouting bigots. It was a Freudian slip if ever there was one. But that only gets us so far. Of course there are some perverts and there are some bigots, but the idea that we can actually have a conversation about this subject around those polarities, the way that we're supposed to have a conversation, a real conversation, around the politics of our time, between the extremes of Fox News and MSNBC, this entire construct, I think most people, especially of the younger generation, realizes is over. At least it's not over in the sense that it isn't healthy and it isn't actually running our lives right now in our culture, but it isn't the answer. And I tried 20 years ago to try and figure out, as a gay man, why it was that I was stuck in this trap, that my own life seemed to have no direction. I did not really identify a lot with what people who supported gay rights also seemed to support. And yet I also didn't identify, because I couldn't, with the views and feelings of my own family, of my own church, of my own background. And so, like many homosexuals of my generation, I had to figure it out for myself. And what I try to do with that is to use something rather old-fashioned, but which I know will be welcome at Gettysburg College, which is reason. I wonder if anybody has a glass of water or a bottle of water, because my voice is a little strained from the recent bug I got. So what I want to do tonight really is to talk about the subject, and to say and to describe really 4 basic positions on this subject, all of which I'm going to crudely caricature, but attempt to explain, and try and argue that every single one of them is wrong. And then I will attempt to say what I think actually is the way forward, which is something which, over the years that I have addressed this subject, has changed quite remarkably. But the reason and the arguments about this, thank you so much, haven't changed really over the decades and over the centuries. And the most powerful politics of homosexuality in the world today, and indeed one of the most powerful strains in this country as well, a strain of thought that actually governs the vast majority of homosexual people across the world, and certainly throughout history, is what I call the prohibitionist position. The prohibitionist position is really based essentially on religious grounds, but reasonable religious grounds, and there are also arguments that are appealing from religion to skeptical and civil and secular people. But the first obvious prohibitionist position is that, look, it's in the Bible. It's quite clear. The foundational document of Western Judeo-Christian society is quite clear on this question. You're not supposed to be gay. It is an abomination. Leviticus says those who commit the crime of lying with a man as he would with a woman should be put to death. And in many countries in the world today, people are still put to death for this particular crime. From Iran, through Saudi Arabia, through a great deal of the Muslim world, and certainly also in the West until very, very recently. This was a crime, famously called a crime against nature. And the Bible actually, I think, is pretty clear about this. That is, in its understanding, and certainly from Leviticus and the Old Testament, I think there's no point in denying that it clearly says this is a sin. There are ways around it, and I think some of the interpretations of the Old Testament have gotten a little out of hand. Thank you so much. But I think denying that the Bible outlaws same-sex sex is to be in denial about what is in the Bible. There is a reason why fundamentalist Christians cannot accept homosexuality. And it's because they take a literal view of what is in the Bible and think that is the fundamental guide to their and our communal lives. The only problem with that argument, of course, is that there are a lot of things in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and that if you really are going to take it literally, one has a lot of other work to do. For example, in the same list that prohibits same-sex sex, it tells you cannot mix fabrics of different kinds. And yet you don't see the religious right campaigning outside Bloomingdale's. This is something that doesn't quite strike them as necessary, or storming legal seafoods because they're giving out shellfish, which also was a prohibition, a clear and permanent prohibition in the same context. Now, Christianity, of course, is not exhausted by simply the Bible, and many, I think, intelligent Christians, and certainly many Catholics, traditionally, have understood that this is not definitive. We're not actually literally interpreting every single verse. And that reasonable people must admit that we can't, and that we do live in a modern society. And most even fundamentalist Christians are not proposing to reinstate the death penalty. I mean, maybe some are, but none that I have had the pleasure of meeting recently. So there is a second argument from prohibitionism, which comes from the Catholic position, the tradition that says, no, we're not literalists, we're not fundamentalists, but we do believe there is something called nature, and we do believe that sex is by nature and by divine nature about reproduction. And that any sex outside of reproduction violates our nature. And this, I don't think, is an argument that can be that glibly dismissed. When you think about it, yes, obviously, our sexuality is about, fundamentally as a species, reproducing ourselves. If we didn't have to reproduce ourselves, probably this aspect of our identity in our lives would not exist. Obviously, the act of sex can lead to babies. And without that, none of us would be here in this room. And that does have a kind of intuitive sense to it, doesn't it? That obviously a male that produces sperm that can become human beings needs an egg to create that human being. And if that is really the goal of this entire reproductive cycle, surely nature therefore rules out, or at least seems to warn against, the possibility of sex which can't do any such thing. And it stands to reason that homosexuals cannot have babies. Me and my husband have tried, but to no apparent effect. Now, of course, this is subject to an obvious point, which is that, yes, but this is also true of many other aspects of heterosexual sexuality. There are many people who are infertile, who for some reason or other are unable to reproduce, even though they can have sex. There are elderly people past menopause who are also unable and very unlikely to conceive a child. The Catholic Church has no problem marrying elderly people and has no problem marrying infertile people. In other words, has no problem actually conveying the sacrament of matrimony, which is defined by sexuality, to those who cannot reproduce. So if the infertile are okay and the elderly are okay, why are the gays not okay? What is the distinguishing characteristic? And I think when you actually look and pore through exactly what the church says, you find that it doesn't really have an answer to that. It simply says, by nature, all sexual activity must be open to procreation. Let me give you another simple exception to the rule. Even if you were to follow Catholic doctrine to the letter, there are 9 months, or actually 10 months, in which a husband, even if he were to obey every single rule of the Catholic Church, and a wife could not actually have sex and create another baby, because the woman would be already pregnant. In other words, it is built into even the heterosexual relationship that sex is going to happen, which is not in itself inherently reproductive. It's also true, quite obviously, that for some reason in nature, we've been created, as men certainly, to produce millions and millions of possible future human beings every day, and an intense desire to set them free. I'm in a college, I do not need to explain the full. You will just have to accept this upon my authority. So the more you look at it, the more this actually doesn't quite make sense. And you realize that you've already built in all these exceptions, and for some reason this particular group, it doesn't apply to them. But the church says, no, we're not bigoted against homosexuals. We just think, again, that reproduction must be essential. And when we understand the infertile can be married or the elderly can be married, we are accepting that a miracle could possibly happen, and that these infertile couples or elderly couples are still open to reproducing if a miracle occurs. To which my response is, well, if a miracle can occur, if we really are talking about miracles which completely create and disrupt human nature, then maybe my husband and I should keep trying. Who is to put a limit on the power of God? So they're then forced back to an argument which says, well, actually what we really need to say is that the world and the universe was made, and supposed to be made, out of two complementary genders. That in fact, the beauty of the universe is there are these principles of male and female, and they come together. And this idea of the complementarity of the sexes, of the supremacy, really, of the heterosexual relationship, is really what lies behind why heterosexuals can be given all sorts of exemptions, but not homosexuals. The trouble with this is that it just isn't true. That nature, if we are going to use that as our criterion, as the church is doing, it calls it natural law. It's one of the most powerful and interesting philosophical traditions in the West, is about what we see in nature and understanding what we see in nature as telling us as what we should be. But we know that in fact now there are many species on Earth which have more than two genders. There are some species of grass that have several dozen genders. There are some species in the sea that change genders in their life. And we also know that among human beings, there are many who are born transgendered or are born with mixed genitals, and people who are born in male bodies who psychologically believe and feel that they are women, and women who are born who psychologically feel that they are men. We know this because over the centuries we have learned more and more about human sexuality and about who human beings actually are in nature. And we know this because we actually have, unlike Thomas Aquinas, gotten past the era of Darwin, and we know what evolution is about. And evolution is about sex, and it is about the superfluity of it and the variety of it. And the more variety, the more resilient a particular species will be. The greater the diversity, the more likely it will survive. It throws up with each generation a variety of genetics, a variety of people, and this particular kind of person, the transgendered, the hermaphrodite, the person of the homosexual, have endured, so far as we can see, through every era and every time and every place in human history. It may be a small minority. It may not be the norm, in the sense that, obviously, most people are heterosexual. But it is certainly there. And if you really want to look at nature, if God's creation is your guide, then why shouldn't God be slightly more creative than we have given God credit for over the years? Maybe there is a purpose to the existence of gay people. Maybe there is a reason for the existence of a spectrum within human sexuality. And many evolutionary psychologists and evolutionary biologists have come up with all sorts of theories as to why this endures. We don't know whether it is actually genetic entirely or whether it's a mixture of genes or whatever. We do know, even though there's now plenty of very interesting research on that. And like everything, it seems that there is some genetic component to this. But we do know certain things that we didn't know before. And it seems to me that there cannot be a conflict between God in this tradition and truth. And that if we have nature as our guide, then we must not close our eyes to some parts of nature and keep them open to others. The prohibitionist view, in other words, ultimately fails. It fails to be consistent within itself, and when it tries to explain its inconsistency, it comes up with an argument that isn't actually true. And so it simply re-insists that this is the way it must be. And those of us within the Catholic tradition who have engaged in a conversation about this with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church have really been unable to have a conversation, because it's difficult to have a conversation when no one else is actually listening to you or even engaging with your arguments. Now, the second version of the politics of homosexuality is what I call liberationist, which is really a product of the New Left and the 1960s and the liberationist movements that swept the United States and the West in the sexual revolution. And in some ways it has a kind of strange parallel to prohibitionism. Because just as the prohibitionists say, basically, homosexuals don't exist, they're just unnatural heterosexuals, or they're heterosexuals who have a problem. So liberationists also say that homosexuals don't really exist, that that's what they call an essentialist position, that sexuality and sexual orientation are all culturally constructed and therefore can be culturally deconstructed. There's no straight, there's no gay. There are just sexual acts. And the goal of life is to liberate ourselves from any restrictions or control or repression of the great freedom of sexuality. The free love doctrine, Foucault's response to Catholicism, in which he was saturated as a young man, was to destroy everything. To say that everything is culture. And what we have to focus on is creating a new culture in which there are no norms, and therefore no hierarchies, no categories, therefore no prisons, no authorities, therefore no oppression, in which the categories of homosexual and heterosexual are abolished in favor of a constant resistance to these very concepts which imprison us. This actually is the philosophical reasoning behind much of the gay rights movement of the 1960s and 70s. It is certainly the overwhelming philosophy that runs behind most queer studies in most university campuses. Most students who want to study gay studies will have to endure, or rather enjoy, the theories of Foucault and of the far left. And I have to say that they too, like the prohibitionists, certainly have a point. Gay people have obviously, through history, existed in every time and place. But the way they've understood themselves, the way they understand what it is to be gay, have changed dramatically. People talk about the ancient Greeks as if they were gay or they tolerated homosexuality. But in fact, when you look at it more closely, you realize, no, there were cultural notions of pederasty. It was related to the exclusion and submission of women, and it was also related to the supremacy of males. It certainly doesn't seem to be the same thing that many of us today as gay people understand to be what our sexual orientation is. In fact, for many of us, it would be regarded as criminal and immoral to abuse people as we would now understand it, who are not of age or of only just of age to consent morally or responsibly to any sexual relationship. I say that simply because, obviously, nonetheless, there are and were gay people back then. They expressed it in different ways. You go to Kandahar in Afghanistan, you will see a totally different understanding of what homosexuality is. You go to a prison anywhere in the United States, you will find expressions of what appear to be homosexuality, but which are conducted by heterosexuals who, the minute they walk out of that prison, will deny that anything happened. Or people who define sexual orientation depending upon exactly the sexual position they take within sex, in which those who penetrate are never gay and those who are penetrated are gay. This is actually a cultural understanding of gayness that is very prevalent in Latin America and in most Catholic countries. So to argue that the left and the Foucault and the notion of social construction of homosexuality is untrue seems to me to be bizarre. Of course it's true. You just have to look at the evidence of history and culture to see that culture matters a huge amount. Even within my lifetime, the understanding of what it means to be a gay person has changed culturally, dramatically, from what it used to be. But here is where I differ. I do think at some level, in my own life, in the lives of others, in one's study of history and of culture, that although there is a huge amount of cultural construction of what it is to be homosexual or heterosexual, it doesn't really go down all the way. There is something beneath culture that, for better word, we will call nature, in which it is clear that some people are just not attracted to the opposite gender, and some people are. They call it by different names, depending on how they're brought up or understood. They understand themselves in different fashions. They may be proud of it or ashamed of it. They may believe in it or suppress it. But they're gay, just as the vast majority of people are straight. And they can't change that. And they don't want to change that. In other words, that nature really is still there. That the impulse to love and be loved by someone of the same gender, as it emerges in the lives and testimonies of gay people, obviously speaks to some extremely powerful and deep and early formation that is culturally formed but cannot be totally culturally explained. There is something underneath culture, something clear and overwhelming and in nature that defies the attempt to abolish it from the left. Just imagine how many gay people through history would have loved to have been straight, but never were and never could, given the oppression and difficulties they must have faced. One of the most persuasive arguments one can make to someone who disagrees with you is like, why would someone choose as a cultural expression or as a social construction to be queer in a society in which that is going to make you marginalized or sidelined, beaten up, discriminated against, and generally lead to a less happy outcome? Why do so many people pretend not to be? Why do so many people keep that pretense up for so long and then finally and ultimately break down? What I'm saying is liberationism is just empirically, in the end, as untrue as prohibitionism. That nature tells us that both are mistaken. So we come to the third politics, which really emerged in the West in the middle to late 20th century. I'm going to call this conservative, like I call a lot of things conservative, in which very few people who call themselves conservatives would agree with me. I must say it's a privilege to be at a place where Eisenhower is celebrated and commemorated, representative of a kind of conservatism that I certainly still share. But Eisenhower doubtless had the following attitude and the belief, which is what one might call private tolerance, public silence. I have nothing against homosexuals, what they do in private. I just don't see why they have to put it in our face the whole time, and why do you have to bring it up? Can't you call it something else? As my mother said, do you have to call it marriage? Can't you call it something else? This notion that I'm not a bigot. I don't hate gay people. I just really rather not talk about it. And I'm aware that, that we need homosexuals. What would happen to our dinner parties and how on earth would we decorate our homes? Where will all the women landscapers come from? As if gay people are sort of hatched under a gooseberry bush in San Francisco and unleashed upon the nation, ensuring that every line is straight and every papal lace dress is perfectly ironed. And again, this is a terrible thing. I know lots of people who are good people who don't want to hurt gay people, but at some point still believe that it's not good for it to be accepted or spoken of, let alone integrated fully into civil and public discourse and institutions. And that the closet really was the great mechanism of this kind of conservatism. And in this kind of conservatism, the important thing was that the gays cooperated, that we also were discreet, used euphemisms, kept our private lives private, did not seek to push it in anybody's faces, and maintained a lovely status quo with perfectly nice people in private, but never actually pushed in public for actual reform or change. And of course, that's true today. It still exists everywhere. But it also is obviously far less true today than it used to be. And the reason is pretty simple. Gay people won't cooperate anymore. They have started, and did a long time ago, refusing to tell a lie every day about who they are and how they feel. Because telling that lie every day is really hard. It takes a huge toll. I don't know how many of you in this room are heterosexuals, but I assume many. Imagine going through one day of your life never mentioning your spouse or the person you have a relationship with, never mentioning your children, never mentioning anything about your private life, never telling anybody what you do in the evenings at work, never talking about your social life. Try it for one day. It's hard. It takes real effort to sustain a lie, because the lie is about the core of one's identity, something that everybody talks about all the time. I remember once having a conversation. A woman took me around on a book tour, charming, lovely woman in San Francisco. I mean, we're not talking Alabama here. And she said, "Why do you have to bring up homosexuality all the time? That's my problem." And I said to her, "Well, why do you have to bring up your heterosexuality all the time?" And she said, "What on earth do you mean? I haven't talked about having sex or anything." I said, "No, you haven't, but neither have I. And having sex is a totally different question. I totally understand the desire not to talk about that in public if you don't want to. But we're not talking about sex. In the last hour I've been in this car, you've mentioned your son, your daughter, and your husband several times in the course of the conversation. It's very hard not to when you meet someone and tell them about your life and have a chat. You've told me you're straight. You haven't realized it, but you have." And so it isn't a question anymore of the majority of gay people being closeted. And as soon as they refuse to cooperate, as soon as they keep bringing it up, this whole compact disappears. Look at gay Republicans. You see, in a way, in the last CPAC conference, an incredible event, which is that a small group, tiny group, our conservative activists, Here Proud is the name of it. And I certainly believe very fundamentally that a homosexual can have a whole range of different kinds of views on politics. Who you are sexually and emotionally attracted to has, it seems to me, very little relationship as to whether the question of whether we should have invaded Iraq or not, or what public sector collective bargaining should be, or all the other public policy debates we have. There is much possibility of diversity of view for homosexual as for heterosexual on subjects that have no relationship with their sexual orientation. So the possibility of gay conservatives is very real. But how many of them are there? And when you look at Geo Proud, the most brave in a way, and conservative element in the gay community, well, first of all, they're out of the closet. Secondly, they support the right to marry. Thirdly, they support the right of people to serve openly as gay people in the military. So even the most conservative elements of the gay community are out of the closet and are of one mind on the question of core civil rights. And we've now heard that next year CPAC will make it a condition of the gay groups that they oppose their own civil rights in order to be a member of the conservative movement, that they actually, only gay people allowed will be those who oppose the right to marry and want to reverse the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Now that comes down to about 3 people, really, and that's kind of remarkable. How often do you see on television any gay person actually advocate against the right to marry? In most minorities, there is some group, some sizable, who will take that position that is the conservative position. But in fact, that debate is over. The reason it's over is because once you are out, once you are no longer lying, once you want to be integrated into your own families, basic civil rights and dignity become non-negotiable. The closet ended this. And the Republican Party, as it has evolved, is really at war with reality of history and of the people in its own ranks. They have to have and have to deny their own children and families the civil rights that they would never deny themselves. Dick Cheney's own daughter is not only a lesbian, but in a committed long-term relationship with children. The daughter of the vice president. You can't swing a cat on the Republican side of the hill without hitting somebody with a lot of hair gel and extremely well-pressed shirts. You see them everywhere. It's a really gay town. And it's a very gay Republican town. The difference is that the generation that is coming up just cannot and will not adopt the attitudes of the 1950s. That's over. When members of the special forces, when members coming home from war, when the first person who lost a limb in Afghanistan were gay, it's over. And not only gay, but out. It's over. That politics, that conservative politics of literally, don't ask, don't tell, cannot exist if we keep telling, even if no one is asking. And so we come to the liberal position, the fourth and last doomed position on homosexuality. We'll have a debate about it subsequently, I hope, is the liberal position, which is that gay people fit into the classic mold of minorities that need to be protected from oppressive majorities. That they must be, first of all, defined in the law as a minority, a specific minority, and then laws must be passed to protect that minority from their fellow citizens. There must be laws against discrimination in employment, maybe even affirmative action. There must be special treatment for hate crimes against people of a minority just because they're of that minority, not because the act itself is any different than if it were committed against a straight person. And this obviously comes from a well-meaning and sympathetic and powerful tradition, certainly within the American civil rights movement, of providing public protections for minority groups. And insofar as, let me say this to begin with, every other group is included in those laws, and in which we have a system and a settlement in a way in this country in which anti-discrimination laws in employment are pretty widely accepted. It seems crazy for me to include every other group but the gays. To have had a federal hate crimes law which forbade hate crimes against every group but gays is nuts. Especially when gays are like the second or third group most likely to experience such hate crimes. Now, it seems to me you can take a position, which is the position I take, which is the whole concept of hate crimes laws is inimical to freedom of expression, and therefore we should get rid of them all. And I think you could take the position that all these poor minority groups need to be protected from the hate of the majority and include them all. But I see absolutely no rational basis upon which you can just decide one particular minority must be exempted from all the liberal laws to protect every other minority, which is, in fact, the position of the current Republican Party. I mean, even if you believe, as some Republicans do, that being gay is a choice, which is simply a denial of the reality, but even if you do, so is religion. The choice of religion, and yet that is protected as a hate crime category under every law, and you're protected against that in discrimination law and employment and all the other liberal protections. So let me say, first of all, if you're going to buy into the liberal argument, you got to buy into the whole thing. The gays have got to be included. They are as discriminated against as anybody else. They have the same struggles of any other minority group. But actually, I find this whole paradigm somewhat disturbing. First of all, it does to human beings and to citizens in an equal society one thing. First of all, it categorizes you and defines you in ways that you may not necessarily think is apt or appropriate for a notion of citizenship which reaches beyond these categories. It, in other words, enforces a sort of balkanized world in which you're a gay or you're disabled or you're a Native American or you're, I could go on for a very long time of every persecuted alleged minority group. And I find that troubling. I want to be a citizen, not a gay citizen. I used to make this joke that there's a group of people called asses, because they always start sentences like, well, as a lesbian, I happen to think, or as an African American, I believe, or as a, and it's like, why can't you just be as an American? Why do we have to, in our public discourse, focus, this has gone a little better recently, but certainly in the 1990s, in which everybody had to be a member of some minority or other in order to have any self-esteem whatsoever. In other words, laws and categories that define, and certainly define as victims, whole categories of people, may be well-meaning, but they also have a cost. They also send signals to people that because they're of a particular nature, they are inherently something that needs someone who needs extra protection, extra support. It kind of almost infantilizes various groups. I'm really happy that I'm gay, but that's not all I am. It definitely is a core part of my identity, but I have other parts of my identity too. I don't want to always have that to define who I am as a human being. I would like, in most cases, for us to get past the heterosexual and homosexual distinction, to be able to be just who we are, human beings, citizens, with the same rights and responsibilities, in which this stuff is interesting. Heaven knows it's interesting. I find people underestimate the interest that straight people have in gay people in their lives. It's fascinating. I would think of the role, people who are trying to understand gender. Well, here you have a whole subculture of entirely men. What happens? What does that tell us about being male? Similarly, with lesbians, we have a whole subculture that's entirely female. What does that tell us? Well, you know the famous joke about sexuality. You know, what does a lesbian bring on a second date? A U-Haul. What does a gay man bring on a date? Second date. The answer is what second date? But if you ask straight men and straight women what their own impulse is, and in the aggregate, of course, we're doing vast generalizations here, you have an insight into the nature of men and women. There are certain contributions that gay people can make to society and have historically made to society in all sorts of ways that are very interesting. And also there is something quite, to me at least, miraculous and beautiful about the creation of new life within a heterosexual marriage that I personally revere and honor. I've never in a million years wanted to diminish or to deny the dignity and beauty of heterosexuality. I wouldn't be here were it not for heterosexuality. But I do want to affirm that those of us who are not heterosexual are also human. And that my sister's marriage is a wonderful example. Her kids I love, and when I was able finally to be civilly married to my husband, and our mothers gave us away at the altar, and our nieces were the ring bearers, and our nephews were the carried the flowers and held on to the dogs. And both of our families, who had also been married, for whom marriage was an institution that bonded generations together, in which this day, I was brought up to believe that the best day of your life, the happiest day of your life, most important day of your life, was not when you became famous, when you got your own reality show, when you earned the most money, when you got the best career or the best grades. I was brought up by a middle-class Catholic family who believe the happiest day of your life is when you find someone you love and who loves you, and you want to commit to that person forever. That's what matters. Well, that escapes the concept of being a victim. It eludes the concept of being put in a different category. It accepts the fact that gay people are born, unlike any other minority, into the very bosom of the majority. That we all grew up, or almost all of us, in heterosexual families. That we grew up expecting, actually, to be straight. But we weren't. We found that out. And to have our families accept that, and then to integrate us into the very institution of marriage that made their lives meaningful, that created the very structure that created us, is finally to bring gay people back home where they belong. It is not, I think, just about coming out, the gay rights movement. It is about coming home. It is about not having to leave one's home, to redefine oneself in a separate category, and then having to come back as a different person, but to be able to be part of both, and to be able to have the affirmation of the very institutions that create family include you, to say that you are also a member of our family. And we're proud, and we are happy. And both of our mothers cried. And we all got nervous, and yes, we screwed up several things, and it was an amazing and weird and beautiful day. What it was not was unnatural. What it was not, in my view, was unchristian. What could be more Christian than the commitment to love and care for another human being for the rest of your life? It's not really about sex. Although sex is great, and I don't want to deny. Again, I'm at a college, there are certain things that one can't even get away with, because you know the reality that it's this incredibly wonderful, exhilarating, and compelling activity to which we are all drawn. But I'll tell you, the great antidote to that great and compelling activity is marrying someone and living with them. It's always bizarre to me that those who really want to cut down gay sex want to oppose gay marriage. Once you've seen somebody at 8 o'clock in the morning dragging their sorry self to the shower, and once you've seen somebody feed the dog, and when you know that he hasn't cleaned out the dishwasher when he should have, every heterosexual knows what I'm talking about. You know what it's really about. And sometimes it's an act of will. rather than simply of love, although it often begins with love. It's an act of will, a decision to say, I will take care of this person forever. I will be responsible for you, and you will be responsible for me. And if something goes wrong, your name is there, and you will come to my help. We learned, I think, the incredibly importance of that during one of the great ironies of the gay rights movement, which was the AIDS epidemic, when suddenly people were in desperate need of help. I remember, I'm going to try and say this without choking up, but it's a true story, going to see a friend of mine who was dying of AIDS in a hospital. And it was a pretty grim ward. It was mainly AIDS patients. This was back in the 90s. And after my friend I was sitting there, the next bed had a curtain drawn around it. You know, like they have those privacy curtains. And inside it, I could hear this man singing a song. And I said to my friend, well, that's kind of, at least he's cheerful. I was like, we may all be dying of AIDS, but he's fine. He said, no, that's actually not him. He died this morning. That's his partner. And his partner will not be allowed by his family, his partner's family, to be at his partner's funeral. Will be evicted from their common flat because he has no rights to be there. And only by the special favor of the nurses on this ward was allowed even to see the man he lived with and loved. And he's still there, and he's still singing that song because that was their song. That was the song they were listening to when they met one another. And he doesn't want to leave because that's the last time he'll be able to feel close to that person. These people's lives were ripped apart. You can't live in an isolated ghetto. We needed our straight friends and our families. We needed the broader society to help us fight this thing and beat it. Until you've seen the indignity that is foisted on people whose basic relationships are denied any fundamental respect, you do not see why marriage matters. It truly matters more than any other issue in this entire debate. And bizarrely, of course, this is, to quote Eisenhower, I guess, obviously a conservative argument, right? What is not conservative about wanting families to be supported and integrated? What is not conservative about wanting a minority group to be integrated into the whole society? What is more conservative than saying, rather than have everybody dependent on the state for help, we will actually assign another human being to help first? So we have something that Burke called the little platoons of society, families, relationships, these things that keep us going, that actually keep us free, because they make the state less necessary, the government less necessary, to take care of us, because we can take care of ourselves. I was recently out sick for a couple of weeks with one of these ghastly bugs that went around, and I don't know what I would have done without my husband being there to take care of me, and vice versa, I might say. Until you realize what it means, you realize that this is a conservative argument, and something in this debate reveals how far conservatism has strayed from its core principles and its core hopes. But the great achievement, I think, of the last 20 or 30 years has been the courage and integrity of gay people and our families and friends. They're more important in many ways. We know from every poll, every crosstab you can get, that the one factor, the only factor that really can predict that someone will be in favor of gay civil rights rather than against is very simple. Do they know someone who's gay or not? That's it. More than ethnicity, politics, call yourself a liberal, a conservative. Religious, not religious. Now, if you know someone, and you really know them, they're part of your family, your friends, you see it, you get it. People, that's why I don't like this category of conservatives always being anti-gay. It's not true. The Republican Party in its orthodoxy is horribly anti-gay. But there are a lot of conservative people, traditional people, who love their gay children. Many of them are the most ferocious advocates for gay equality. Because once it clicks, it clicks. When it's your son, when it's your mom, when it's your sister or your brother, you get it. Because in the end, the question of homosexuality is not about sex. It's not about politics. It's about, while not denying the validity of either of those things, it is about love and the need and the core human yearning to be loved and to love as the core meaning of our existence on this planet. That's why I'm proud to be a part of the civil rights movement, because it is about getting past politics to something much deeper and more important than that. So thank you. I'm